Lori rot in prison. We can't do that. Let's go.
She called herself the Mother of Zion, a chosen one in an unfolding apocalypse. But behind that radiant smile, 2 children were already marked for death. It began with faith and ended with fire. Lori Vallow was the suburban mother everyone admired, bright, composed, and devoted. To neighbors, she seemed like the perfect mom. She had 2 children, JJ and Tylee, and a life that looked ordinary from the outside. But somewhere beneath the calm, something had started to crack. In 2018, Lori met Chad Daybell, a self-proclaimed prophet who claimed to speak with the dead. He wrote doomsday novels predicting an imminent end of the world and promised that chosen souls would rise to rule a purified earth. To Lori, who already believed in signs and visions, he wasn't just a writer, he was destiny. Their connection was immediate and dangerous. Within weeks, she was drawn into his prophecies, believing they were chosen by God to lead the 144,000 saved souls. But to fulfill that prophecy, Chad claimed they needed to rid the world of darkness. Darkness in their eyes meant anyone who questioned them, even family. Lori's transformation was swift. She began speaking of her husband and children as zombies, souls overtaken by evil spirits. Friends noticed her cold detachment, but no one could fully grasp the storm brewing behind her eyes. Then the deaths began. In July 2019, Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, confronted her about Chad and her growing obsession. Days later, Charles was shot dead by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, who claimed self-defense. The case was quietly closed, but the pattern of destruction had only begun. Lori moved to Idaho to be closer to Chad. Her children, 7-year-old JJ and 17-year-old Tylee, came with her. Neighbors saw them playing outside, smiling, alive, until one day they were simply gone. When relatives called, Lori had explanations. JJ was with a friend. Tylee was away at college. But every story was different. Every smile a little too controlled. By late 2019, suspicion was mounting. JJ's grandparents reported the children missing. Police knocked on Lori's door, and she calmly told them JJ was fine, staying with a family friend. The next day, Lori and Chad packed their belongings and vanished. The case spread nationwide. Images of JJ's bright grin and Tylee's warm eyes filled every screen. Reporters called Lori the Doomsday Mom. Authorities began to uncover a trail of sudden deaths surrounding the couple. Chad's wife, Tania Daybell, had mysteriously died just weeks before he married Lori. It was as if everyone who stood between them ended up dead. In June 2020, the horror reached its peak. Investigators searching Chad's property made a devastating discovery: 2 shallow graves behind his home. Inside were the remains of JJ and Tylee. JJ was found wrapped in plastic and tape. Tylee's body was dismembered and burned beyond recognition. The world stopped. Even seasoned detectives cried at the scene. A mother's love turned to something unrecognizable. Delusion disguised as destiny. When confronted, Lori showed no visible grief. She smiled in court, even laughed at times, as though untouched by the tragedy surrounding her. Prosecutors described her as the architect of chaos. The defense claimed she was a victim of manipulation, brainwashed by Chad's apocalyptic visions. But the evidence painted a darker truth. Phone records placed her at critical moments. Messages revealed plans cloaked in religious language: zombies, light, and missions. Her brother, the so-called protector, died mysteriously months later. Every thread seemed to lead back to one belief: the world must end, and only they would remain. During the trial, Lori's silence was chilling. Witnesses described her laughter during funerals, her cold denial when asked about her children. Experts testified about the psychological control Chad held, but even they admitted Lori had embraced the darkness willingly. When the verdict came, the courtroom fell silent. Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Yet even in the final moments, she refused to take responsibility. She quoted scripture, smiled faintly, and said her children were happy in heaven. Outside the courthouse, JJ's grandparents wept. They had fought for justice for 3 long years and won. But there was no victory in it, only sorrow and a question that would never fade. How does love become this? How does a mother's faith twist so far that she believes killing her own children is an act of salvation? The Lori Vallow case became one of the most haunting crimes in modern America, not just for its brutality, but for its meaning. It exposed the fragility of belief, the ease with which conviction can turn to obsession, and long after the cameras fade, one image remains: a quiet backyard in Idaho, where 2 children were buried beneath the faith that destroyed them. Because in the end, there are no chosen ones, only the innocent left behind. She was the nurse everyone trusted, the smiling face in the neonatal unit. Parents handed their babies into her arms, believing their children were safe. But beneath that calm exterior, a darkness had taken hold. Lucy Letby appeared ordinary, meticulous, caring, and devoted to her work. She had trained at top hospitals, and colleagues often praised her professionalism. Her small frame and quiet demeanor masked a growing obsession, one that no one could see. In 2016, she began working in the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU, at Countess of Chester Hospital. Infants were delicate, fragile, and wholly dependent on adults. Lucy was supposed to be their guardian angel. Instead, she became the silent predator. Over the next 2 years, mysterious incidents began to surface. Babies developed sudden collapses, unexplained seizures, and in some tragic cases, died unexpectedly. Doctors were baffled, nurses were alarmed, families were devastated. At first, no one suspected Lucy. She comforted grieving parents, stayed late, and always appeared vigilant. Her care was praised. Her presence seemed reassuring. Yet she left a trail of unexplained medical crises in her wake. Patterns began to emerge. Every collapse, every death coincided with her shifts. Alarm bells rang quietly among staff, but hospitals struggled to connect the dots. How could someone so seemingly devoted cause so much harm? Lucy's motives remained chillingly opaque. Psychologists later described her behavior as a mix of control, compulsion, and desire for attention. She was often seen smiling inappropriately during emergencies, a signal no one fully understood at the time. Investigations intensified in 2018 after her colleagues insisted something was wrong. Internal audits revealed that infant collapses spiked during Lucy's presence. Video surveillance and careful timeline reconstruction uncovered a horrifying truth. She had deliberately harmed children. The trial that followed shocked the nation. Parents sat stone-faced in court, struggling to comprehend the betrayal. Lucy Letby's actions were methodical, deliberate, and sustained over years. She had harmed infants entrusted to her care, exploiting their vulnerability. Witnesses described the terror in the NICU when patterns were noticed. Medical experts testified about the unnatural frequency of collapses and deaths, the signs that had been missed, and the devastating emotional impact on families. Every detail painted a grim picture of betrayal and manipulation. Lucy's defense attempted to claim negligence or mental disturbance, but the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, work logs, and timelines aligned to prove deliberate action. Every infant she harmed, every life cut short, became a piece in the narrative of her serial offenses. When the jury delivered the verdict, the courtroom trembled. Lucy Letby was convicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. She received a whole life order, meaning she would spend the rest of her life in prison.
I'm going to put you in the back seat over here.
Hold on, Mom.
Yes. Just take a seat in there for me, Lucy.
The emotional weight of the case lingered far beyond the courtroom walls. Families who had trusted her with their most precious treasures had to come to terms with unimaginable betrayal. The medical community faced intense scrutiny, questioning how someone so dangerous could operate undetected for years. The Lucy Letby case is a cautionary tale about trust, vigilance, and the darkest corners of human behavior. It revealed how evil can hide behind smiles, uniforms, and comforting hands. It forced society to confront a terrifying reality. Sometimes the ones meant to protect us are the ones who harm us most. Even now, the memory of those infants and their families haunts viewers. It raises questions with no easy answers. How could a community of professionals miss the signs? How do we reconcile faith in caregivers with human fallibility? And how do parents move forward when the hands meant to heal betrayed them? The legacy of Lucy Letby is both a warning and a mourning. Every hospital protocol tightened, every oversight committee scrutinized, every parent's vigilance forever altered. Her story leaves an indelible mark, a reminder of innocence destroyed, trust broken, and justice served, though it can never restore what was lost. Because sometimes the monsters wear the most familiar faces. She smiled at the neighbors, waved to the mail carrier, and went about her life as if nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, a horrifying secret waited. Virginia McCullough was the daughter everyone thought they knew, polite, quiet, and unassuming. She lived with her parents in a modest suburban home in the UK, maintaining appearances that were, on the surface, perfectly normal. Friends visited, family gatherings took place, and the world had no reason to suspect the darkness growing within her. In early 2022, Virginia's life took a turn, though the cause remained hidden. Her parents, beloved in the community, mysteriously disappeared. The police investigated briefly, assumed they had moved or had family emergencies. Neighbors, too, whispered. But life carried on, as neighbors' whispers often do. For months, Virginia maintained the facade. She collected their mail, answered their phone calls, and even attended social events, all while her parents' bodies lay inside their own home. She cooked, cleaned, and went shopping, meticulously covering every trace of what she had done. To the outside world, it was a story of absence, not atrocity. Her deception was chilling in its precision. Virginia knew exactly what to say, exactly how to act, and exactly what to hide. No one could have guessed that inside. She carried the weight of murder and prolonged concealment. The first cracks appeared when neighbors noticed strange odors, unusual patterns, and the absence of her parents' usual activity. Rumors began to circulate, subtle at first, growing into suspicion. When authorities finally investigated the house in 2024, they were met with a scene that seemed impossible. Inside, the bodies of Virginia's parents were discovered. They had been dead for years, hidden within the very walls and rooms where she had lived, laughed, and carried on her life. The shock reverberated through the community. How could a daughter do this? How could she maintain a normal facade while living with such a secret? During the trial, psychologists described her behavior as methodical, detached, and chillingly organized. She had managed isolation, concealment, and social interactions with extraordinary precision. The prolonged nature of the crime added layers of tension to the case. It was not a momentary lapse, but a sustained deception that spanned years. Prosecutors detailed how she meticulously avoided detection, manipulating neighbors, friends, and anyone who came near her. Witnesses testified to her outward normalcy, the quiet daughter, the obedient child, and how this made the crime all the more horrifying. Her actions represented a profound betrayal of trust, the most intimate kind, within a family home. The trial gripped the nation. Images of the home, interviews with neighbors, and expert testimony painted a picture of chilling normalcy overlaying unspeakable horror. Every detail of how she lived with the truth, while pretending everything was ordinary, left viewers and the court in disbelief. Virginia's defense argued mental disturbance and extreme stress, but the evidence was overwhelming. The planning, concealment, and calculated behavior demonstrated intent and awareness. Each piece of evidence, from forensic analysis to eyewitness accounts, reinforced the impossibility of innocence. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Virginia McCullough was convicted of murder and concealment of the deaths of her parents. She received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would never harm again. The aftermath left a community shaken. Neighbors reflected on the subtle signs they had missed. Families questioned their own awareness, realizing how appearances could mask terrible truths. Even seasoned detectives admitted the prolonged deception challenged conventional investigative assumptions. The Virginia McCullough case is a haunting study of human psychology, trust, and deception. It reveals how normalcy can be a mask and how betrayal can hide in plain sight. It forces a reflection on vigilance, the fragility of family bonds, and the darkness some carry quietly within. Even now, the house stands as a silent reminder. Laughter and life once filled it. Yet beneath the surface lay horror. The story leaves one question lingering in the mind of every viewer. How can someone live so long among us and hide such evil? Because sometimes the face we trust most is the one capable of the unimaginable. She smiled for the camera, rocked her baby to sleep, and hid a dark secret that spanned over a decade. Marybeth Tinning appeared to be the perfect mother. She lived in upstate New York, devoted to her family, attentive to her children, and admired by neighbors for her warmth. But behind her gentle smile, a pattern of death was quietly unfolding. Between 1972 and 1985, 9 of Marybeth's children died under mysterious circumstances. At first, the tragedies were seen as heartbreaking misfortunes. Doctors investigated, but causes were often attributed to natural complications, sudden infant death syndrome, illness, or unforeseen accidents. Marybeth grieved publicly, a mother torn by repeated heartbreak. Yet suspicion began to simmer beneath the surface. 11 children in total had been born, and only 2 survived. The repetition of loss raised questions, but answers were elusive. Her sorrow seemed genuine, her demeanor compassionate, masking the horrifying truth. Over the years, Marybeth's behavior drew scrutiny. Neighbors noticed inconsistencies in her stories. Doctors noted anomalies in medical reports and questioned the likelihood of so many deaths in one family. Despite these concerns, the legal system moved slowly, hampered by the assumption that she was simply unlucky. The tragedy escalated into a chilling pattern. Each child's death followed a similar timeline: nighttime crises, unexplained illness, sudden collapse. Yet Marybeth remained calm, composed, and ever-present. The grieving mother the community pitied and supported. Psychologists later described her as exhibiting attention-seeking behaviors, craving sympathy and validation. The line between maternal care and malevolent intent blurred, leaving experts perplexed. Her actions revealed a mix of manipulation, planning, and psychological disturbance, a case study in prolonged familial betrayal. By 1985, investigators began to piece together the grim narrative. Forensic reviews, interviews, and a deep dive into medical records revealed the repeated nature of her children's deaths. Evidence suggested that Marybeth's role was not accidental. Her behavior indicated awareness and, ultimately, intent. The trial captivated the nation. Families, neighbors, and media outlets struggled to comprehend the prolonged deception. Marybeth Tinning had turned motherhood into a stage for manipulation, hiding darkness behind grief and propriety. Each testimony, each medical report, and each recollection of her public persona amplified the shock and disbelief. During court proceedings, experts highlighted the long-term psychological impact of her acts. The surviving children were forced to confront the horrifying reality that the mother who raised them had harmed their siblings. Marybeth's motive, the psychological need for attention and sympathy, added a disturbing layer to the narrative. The extended timeline intensified suspense, keeping the audience engaged with each revelation. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom fell silent. Marybeth Tinning was convicted of the murder of her last child, though authorities acknowledged the pattern of her prior acts. She received a prison sentence that reflected the severity of her crimes. Justice, though delayed, finally aligned with the long trail of deception she left behind. The Marybeth Tinning case remains one of the most haunting examples of long-term familial betrayal. It raises difficult questions about human behavior, societal assumptions, and how repeated tragedies can mask deliberate harm. It forces reflection on trust, the sanctity of family, and how appearances can deceive. Even decades later, the story resonates. A mother's face once warm with love concealed the unimaginable. Viewers are left to grapple with lingering questions. How many tragedies could have been prevented? How do we detect malevolence hidden behind grief? And how does prolonged manipulation affect a community's perception of innocence and guilt? Because sometimes the hands meant to nurture carry the most devastating secrets.
She seemed like any other mother, devoted, caring, attentive to her children's every need. But in 2001, the Yates household in Houston, Texas, became the site of a tragedy that shocked a nation. Andrea Yates had battled depression for years. After the birth of each of her 5 children, her mental health worsened, culminating in severe postpartum psychosis. Her husband, friends, and doctors noticed changes: insomnia, obsessive thoughts, and an increasing detachment from reality. In the early hours of June 20, 2001, Andrea carried out a horrifying act. She drowned all 5 of her children, Noah, John, Paul, Mary, and Lucy, in their bathtub, one by one. The scene was harrowing, yet Andrea remained calm, almost serene, as if believing she was saving them from some imagined fate. If you're still watching right now, it means you don't just want stories. You want to understand why people do the unthinkable. Take a second to subscribe. It helps us bring you more cases that reveal the psychology behind true evil. And if this story hits you hard, drop a comment below. I read everyone. Your thoughts make these stories human again. Neighbors and family were devastated. Police were called, and Andrea was taken into custody without resistance. The scale of the tragedy stunned the community and the nation, sparking debates on maternal mental health, responsibility, and justice. Her background revealed a woman under immense pressure. Andrea had faced relentless stress from repeated pregnancies, isolation, and pre-existing depression. She had sought help from psychiatrists, taken medication, and attended therapy, but the illness persisted. Postpartum psychosis had overtaken her perception of reality, blending fear, delusion, and desperation. Psychologists later described her mindset during the incident as dominated by delusions. She believed she was saving her children from eternal damnation, convinced that the world was unsafe and their lives were doomed. In her mind, drowning them was an act of mercy, a horrifying distortion of care. The trial was widely covered in the media. Prosecutors argued that Andrea was responsible for the deaths of her children, presenting the tragic sequence of events. Defense experts testified extensively about her mental illness, emphasizing the severe psychosis that drove her actions. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed her as a cold killer, others as a mentally ill mother who needed help. During testimony, Andrea's mental state became clear. She could not differentiate reality from delusion during the tragic act. Her calm demeanor during recounting shocked the court, but experts affirmed it was a symptom of her psychosis, not indifference. In 2002, Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. However, after years of appeals and re-evaluation of psychiatric evidence, her conviction was overturned. In 2006, a retrial acquitted her on the grounds of insanity, recognizing that her postpartum psychosis had rendered her unable to understand the nature of her actions. The case raised important discussions nationwide. It highlighted gaps in mental health care, particularly for postpartum conditions. It forced the public to consider the delicate balance between accountability and compassion, horror and empathy. Families, mental health professionals, and the media reflected on what could have been done to prevent the tragedy. Awareness of postpartum psychosis increased, and protocols for early intervention in high-risk mothers were strengthened. Yet the emotional weight of Andrea Yates's actions continues to haunt. 5 children lost their lives, leaving a grieving family and a society struggling to comprehend the scale of her suffering and the consequences of untreated mental illness. The Andrea Yates case stands as both a tragedy and a cautionary tale. It explores the darkest intersections of maternal love, mental illness, and societal expectations. It forces viewers to question, how can we prevent such horror without vilifying the mentally ill? And how do we reconcile sympathy with the unimaginable reality of loss? Because sometimes the mind meant to protect becomes the instrument of irreversible tragedy. From a mother whose mind shattered under the weight of postpartum psychosis, to a mother who chose lies over love. One was consumed by delusion, another by calculation. Evil can stem from despair, intent, or a twisted escape. And sometimes, the tragedy begins behind the most familiar face.
She appeared distraught, standing on the roadside, tears streaking her face, clutching her car keys. Her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months, were missing. To the world, it seemed a mother's worst nightmare had come true. In reality, the nightmare was far worse, because Susan Smith knew exactly where her sons were. On October 25, 1994, Smith had driven her car into a nearby lake, drowning her 2 children inside. Immediately after, she concocted a story that a carjacker had taken her children, fleeing with them. The tale was detailed, emotional, and convincing, and it worked. For days, the nation watched, horrified by the kidnapping of 2 innocent boys. Police conducted searches, helicopters scanned the lake, and news anchors reported every possible lead. Susan's grief was front and center, a convincing mask hiding the unthinkable truth. As investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Witnesses noted details that didn't align with her story. Her statements shifted, small lies piling up, creating cracks in the carefully crafted narrative. Each interview, Each press appearance added pressure, as experts noticed psychological cues that hinted at deception. The public was captivated and enraged as hope turned to suspicion. How could a mother, seemingly loving, fabricate such a story? Media coverage intensified, and Susan became the focus of both sympathy and mounting doubt. Eventually, forensic evidence could not be ignored. Diving teams recovered the bodies of Michael and Alexander from the lake, confirming what authorities had begun to suspect. Investigators confronted Susan with the evidence, and under intense scrutiny, her story collapsed. She confessed. She had killed her children alone and then lied to the entire nation. Psychologists later examined her actions. Smith exhibited extreme psychological distress and personal motivations that contributed to her decision, including a desire to free herself from parental responsibilities and relationship pressures. Yet the cold calculation of covering her crime, manipulating authorities, and deceiving a grieving public left many struggling to reconcile the horror with her outward persona. During the trial, the courtroom was tense. The prosecution highlighted the cruelty and premeditation of the act, presenting evidence of both motive and deception. Witnesses testified to her behavior, her lies, and the emotional manipulation that had gripped a nation. The case became a study in betrayal and the complex nature of maternal violence. When Susan Smith was sentenced, she received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Justice was served, but the emotional impact remained. Families across the country mourned with a renewed awareness of the fragility of trust. The public grappled with the moral conflict. A mother who should have protected her children had instead destroyed them. The Susan Smith case endures as a haunting reminder of deception, moral failure, and human complexity. It challenges viewers to consider how appearances can mask cruelty and how societal assumptions about motherhood can blind us to the truth. Even decades later, the horror resonates. A mother's lie became a story that shocked a nation, leaving a legacy of grief and disbelief. Because sometimes the face that seems most familiar can conceal the darkest betrayal. From a mother who drowned her children while spinning a web of lies, to a mother who pulled the trigger and staged her story for the world. One hid the truth behind tears, another behind calculated chaos. Evil wears many masks, and the face of trust can become the face of horror. She smiled for the cameras, appearing distraught as paramedics rushed into her home. 3 of her children had been shot, 2 critically wounded, 1 dead. Diane Downs claimed a stranger had broken in and opened fire, a horrifying tale that drew national attention. At first, authorities and the public believed her story. A mother surviving such an attack seemed plausible, and her tears were convincing. News outlets broadcast her grief, interviews portrayed her as a victim, and sympathy poured in from across the country. But something didn't add up. Detectives noticed inconsistencies in her story, small details that contradicted the physical evidence. Witness accounts, timelines, and forensic analysis hinted at an unsettling possibility. Diane Downs was not a victim, she was the perpetrator. The investigation intensified. Forensic experts examined the trajectory of the bullets, the wounds, and the positioning of the children. The pattern indicated intentional shooting, not a random act of violence by a stranger. Questions about motive arose, and authorities began to suspect that the narrative she had carefully crafted was a lie. As pressure mounted, Diane's behavior became increasingly erratic. She changed her story repeatedly, trying to maintain control over the narrative. Psychologists later analyzed her conduct, noting manipulative tendencies, attention-seeking behavior, and a disturbing disregard for her children's lives. The betrayal of trust, the very people she should have protected, was staggering. The trial became a national spectacle. Evidence was presented in painstaking detail, from forensic reconstructions to eyewitness testimony. Prosecutors emphasized her calculated actions, the premeditation, and the deception following the shootings. Defense attorneys attempted to frame her as unstable, but the weight of evidence left little room for doubt. The courtroom was tense. Families of the victims, journalists, and spectators listened as the story unfolded, each revelation amplifying the shock. The contrast between her outward appearance as a grieving mother and the horrifying reality of her actions captured the nation's attention. Diane Downs was convicted of the murder of her daughter Cheryl and the attempted murders of her sons, Stephen and Danny. She received a bought-life sentence plus 75 years, ensuring she would never harm her children again. The verdict brought legal closure, but emotional scars remained. The Diane Downs case continues to resonate because it explores the darkest depths of maternal betrayal. It challenges assumptions about family, trust, and appearances. Viewers are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Evil can hide behind the most familiar faces. Her story remains a chilling reminder of how deception, manipulation, and moral collapse can converge in the most intimate spaces. Even decades later, the narrative haunts the public imagination. Courtroom images, media coverage, and forensic reconstructions provide a stark window into her actions, keeping the psychological tension alive for new audiences. The case prompts reflection on prevention, vigilance, and the fragility of trust. Because sometimes the person sworn to protect can become the architect of unimaginable horror. From a mother who shot her children while weaving a story of survival, to a mother who took another's unborn child in a calculated act of obsession. One betrayed trust in a moment of violence. The other planned it for weeks. Evil shifts, but the darkness behind maternal care never fades. She watched the mother-to-be with obsession, planning a crime that would shock the nation. On December 16, 2004, Lisa Montgomery entered the home of Bobby Joe Stinnett, a pregnant woman in Missouri with one goal: take her baby. To the world, the story seemed almost unbelievable. Montgomery strangled Bobby Joe and abducted the newborn, creating headlines that stunned the country. The brutality of the act, combined with the audacity, left viewers in disbelief. Montgomery's life had been marked by trauma and mental illness. Psychiatrists later described her as suffering from severe depression, bipolar disorder, and delusions. Her childhood included abuse, neglect, and early exposure to violence, factors that contributed to her distorted perception of right and wrong. The investigation moved quickly. Law enforcement traced clues, coordinated with neighbors, and pieced together the timeline. Montgomery's attempts to hide the baby failed. She was arrested within hours. The evidence was undeniable, and the crime scene left little room for doubt. During the trial, her mental health became a central focus. Experts testified about her delusions and psychological disorders, arguing that she was not fully in control of her actions. The prosecution countered, emphasizing the planning, deception, and manipulation involved in abducting the baby. The courtroom became a stage for intense moral and legal debate, balancing accountability with compassion for a troubled mind. Public reaction was intense. Audiences struggled with the horror of the crime and the complexity of Montgomery's psyche. How could someone capable of such premeditated violence also be a victim of mental illness? The duality created a lingering tension. Fear and fascination intertwined. Montgomery was initially sentenced to death, a verdict that reflected the severity and premeditation of the act. However, appeals highlighted her mental health struggles, her traumatic past, and questions about her capacity for intent. In later proceedings, her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole, leaving many conflicted about justice and mercy. The case forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about mental illness, maternal violence, and the legal system. It highlighted the challenges of discerning intent in extreme cases and the ethical dilemmas of punishment. For mental health professionals, Montgomery's story became a tragic example of untreated trauma escalating into catastrophic actions. Even today, the Lisa Montgomery case resonates because of its tension and moral complexity. It is a story of horror, psychological disturbance, and the limits of human empathy. Viewers are left reflecting on prevention, the warning signs of mental illness, and how societal failures can contribute to unimaginable outcomes. Because sometimes the desire to protect and nurture can be warped by trauma, creating consequences that haunt forever. From a mother who stole life at birth, to a mother who ended the lives of her own children before attempting escape herself. Obsession, despair, and distorted reality. Different motives, same chilling betrayal. When maternal care becomes a weapon, innocence is always the casualty. She was a mother devoted, loving, or so it seemed. But inside her home, the lines between care and cruelty blurred, leaving a trail of heartbreak. Tania Clarence lived in a quiet corner of the UK, raising 3 children, all of whom had severe disabilities. To the outside world, she appeared committed, attentive, and compassionate, devoting herself entirely to their care. Neighbors admired her resilience, while friends often remarked on the emotional and physical toll she carried. But beneath the surface, a darkness grew. Tania struggled with mental health issues, battling depression and anxiety, compounded by exhaustion and isolation. The demands of caring for 3 vulnerable children weighed heavily, clouding judgment and amplifying emotional turmoil. In 2014, tragedy struck. One by one, her children stopped breathing. Each death seemed sudden, but the signs were there, subtle, unnoticed, or misinterpreted by those around her. Authorities began to question the circumstances, but Tania maintained composure, insisting she had done everything possible. The investigation revealed a harrowing picture. Medical reports indicated that the children had been smothered, acts that could only have been deliberate. Psychologists examined Tania's state of mind, exploring the intersection of mental illness, parental stress, and moral responsibility. It became clear that her mental health struggles had contributed to a distortion of care, turning protection into harm. Neighbors, friends, and even some family members were left grappling with disbelief. How could a mother, someone entrusted with life itself, become the instrument of death for her own children? The moral complexity of the case left the public conflicted, torn between understanding her mental health struggles and condemning the ultimate consequences of her actions. Court proceedings revealed the depth of Tania's psychological turmoil. Experts described how extreme fatigue, depression, and the relentless demands of caregiving had eroded her perception of reality. Yet the deliberate nature of the acts could not be ignored. It was not mere accident. Each child's death bore the marks of intentionality, despite her compromised mental state. During testimony, prosecutors carefully balanced the narrative. They conveyed both the horror of the acts and the human struggle behind them. Witnesses painted a portrait of a mother trapped between love and darkness, someone who had failed to reconcile the two. The verdict was not straightforward. Tania Clarence was placed under a hospital order rather than traditional incarceration. The ruling reflected her mental health condition, acknowledging that treatment was necessary alongside accountability. The public response was mixed. Some saw justice served through rehabilitation. Others struggled with the idea that death had been met with anything less than full punishment. The case forced a national conversation about parental responsibility, mental illness, and ethical boundaries. It challenged assumptions about caregiving, trust, and the complexities of moral judgment. For professionals and parents alike, Tania's story became a cautionary tale, illustrating how extreme stress, isolation, and untreated mental illness can distort perception and decision-making. Yet, even in the aftermath, the lingering questions remain. Could more support have prevented this tragedy? How do we protect vulnerable children while addressing parental mental health? And how do we reconcile compassion with justice when the lines between them blur? The Tania Clarence case is a study in moral tension. It is a story that evokes sorrow, empathy, and reflection in equal measure. It leaves audiences conflicted, mourning the loss of innocent lives, yet recognizing the human vulnerabilities that contributed to the tragedy. Because sometimes, the hardest question is not who is guilty, but how we define responsibility when love, stress, and mental illness collide. The morning seemed ordinary, the kind of day any family might wake to. But for Theresa Riggi, ordinary was about to shatter into horror. In 2010, in New York City, Theresa committed an act that stunned the nation. She killed her 2 young children, then jumped from a balcony in a desperate attempt at escape. The fall left her critically injured but alive, a shocking twist that ensured the truth would emerge. Neighbors had seen a loving mother, attentive to her children, engaged in the rhythms of daily life. Yet behind closed doors, tensions and desperation festered. Theresa's mental health struggles, marital issues, and personal pressures combined to create a perfect storm of psychological instability. The act itself was horrific. Investigators arrived to find a scene of unimaginable loss. Her children were dead, victims of deliberate violence, and Theresa was barely clinging to life. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, where she would later provide details that revealed the full scope of her actions. During her recovery, Theresa described the events leading up to the tragedy. She spoke of emotional overwhelm, despair, and a sense of hopelessness that had clouded her judgment. Psychologists later examined her history, noting chronic depression, emotional dysregulation, and situational stressors that contributed to her actions. Her words, spoken from a hospital bed, provided chilling insight into the mind of a mother who crossed the ultimate moral boundary. The investigation meticulously reconstructed the timeline. Forensic evidence, witness statements, and her own admissions painted a clear picture. Theresa Riggi had planned and executed the murders, then attempted suicide to escape the consequences. Her survival ensured that justice could be pursued, giving prosecutors the opportunity to present a full account in court. The trial captured national attention. Jurors, families, and media outlets grappled with both the horror of the act and the psychological complexities of the perpetrator. Defense attorneys highlighted mental health struggles, while the prosecution emphasized premeditation and moral responsibility. The courtroom drama became a study in tension, as viewers across the country followed each revelation with disbelief and shock. Theresa was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment, concluding a tragic and terrifying story of parental betrayal. The legal outcome provided closure, but the emotional weight of the case lingered. Families, psychologists, and the public were forced to confront questions about mental illness, stress, and the capacity for parental harm. The Riggi case continues to resonate for its drama, moral conflict, and shocking twist of survival. It underscores the fragile line between ordinary family life and unthinkable tragedy. Viewers are left reflecting on the complexities of human psychology, the consequences of untreated mental health issues, and the horrifying potential for betrayal by those closest to us. Because sometimes the hands meant to nurture can deliver the most devastating consequences. These stories leave a mark, and we want to hear from you. Comment below which case shocked you the most. If this journey into darkness captivated you, like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Your support keeps the truth coming, one chilling story at a time.